Welcome to the Mobility Talks. You are watching episode 21 of your favorite web series by EIT Urban Mobility. As we are all reconnecting with colleagues and work deadlines after the summer break, today we are discussing reconnecting cities with mobility, people and places. We've talked about public space several times in these mobility talks. I can think of particularly episode 9 and 15. If you want to look back at some of the previous episodes, all of that is available on the EIT Urban Mobility website. And you may also be interested to look at the EIT Urban Mobility report that was released in November last year on 15-minute cities and how to bring about human-centered urban planning. The link will be added to the chat. But today we're going to go even deeper into the necessary transformations of the urban public space to ensure that urban mobility solutions are part of making places livable as opposed to making them detrimental to public space. And we'll be looking at evolutions in urban planning to accommodate for the myriad of urban mobility solutions that are constantly challenging the use of public space. In this area, actually, something as simple and natural as walking can actually seem like an innovation. If urban planning and transformation of public space has, for instance, enabled public spaces to be perceived as more walkable. So today's talk will really go at the heart of that connection between urban planning and urban mobility, which may not always be as connected as they should. As usual, it's great to see so many of you joining our mobility talks from all around the world. We have participants today joining us from 48 different countries, spanning across continents and time zones. So welcome to those of you joining us from India, Egypt, the Philippines, Peru, Canada, to name but a few, and of course to our regular European audience. Also interesting to see the balance in representation with participants coming from academia, the private sector and the public sector especially. But for this specific episode, a special welcome to the many students who are attending. Hopefully this talk will give you some good ideas as you may be the future of building, urban planning and urban mobility. So please get involved in the discussion. You have a chat box where you can react, give your comments, but you also have a questions box where you can, drop your questions. You can also upvote your favorite questions, and I will be monitoring all of this, and I will be raising comments, reactions, questions to our great speakers today so that we can make this session as interactive as possible. Okay, so without further ado, I would like to introduce you to our speakers of the day. Please welcome Kaisa Spilling. She is Development Manager at Forum Virium Helsinki. Welcome, Kaisa. We have Maximilian Jager. He is Urban Mobility Expert at Austria Tech. Welcome, Maximilian. We have Philippe Rapin. He is CEO of Urban Radar. Welcome, Philippe. And Alexandra Gomez, she is Research Fellow at LSE Cities. Hey, Alexandra, welcome to the four of you. So to kick off this session, I challenged our speakers to tell us a little story today. As we're talking about reconnecting cities, reconnecting people, I wanted to know, where do people actually meet in the cities where you're either based, or in some of the cities that you've worked with, or in some of the cities that you've done some research on, whatever it is you might be doing in your field. Where do people meet? How do they get there? And what does that say about the use of public space? So I'd like to first travel over to Helsinki, Kaisa. Can you tell us the story around Helsinki?
Yes, welcome to Helsinki. So my name is Kaisa Spilling and I work for the Helsinki-owned innovation company Forum Virium Helsinki. And I've had Helsinki as my urban lab for new solutions for the past 10 years and been working with both new and older districts in Helsinki. And today I'll take you to Malmi, which is one of the urban regeneration areas, suburban regeneration areas, about 15 minutes from the city center. And it's also a place where there will be a lot of development done during the next coming years. And that means that we need to look at the urban space within the district. So there in the picture you see the Ylämalmi Square, which is a space which is normally a place where people pass by on their way to the train station, on their way to the city or to other places, or on their way for errands in the shops and other commercial spaces. And well, we wanted it to be more for a place to meet than a place for just passing by. And I think placemaking and experimentation have been the ways that we've been kind of trying to change the storyline. And from 2021, so Forum Virium Helsinki has been piloting with modular street furniture with the company Parkly. And the people really liked it. So it kind of provided places to stay in the square. And the following years, the city has been doing more placemaking activities together with Parkly. And us from Forum Virium, as we always work with innovation and digitalization, have been helping them to gather data and insights to feed into the planning as the city's planning of whole renovation of the square within a couple of years in 2025. And we can really say that the feedback from citizens has provided more activities, more green, more programming, and, for example, market activities in the space that has also kind of been making the square more welcoming for the citizens. But there's more than that happening in Malmi, as it's one of our innovation districts where we do a lot of activities. So sorry, another story, a short one as well. And I come from Finland, and in Finland we have very long, dark fall and winter time. It's still coming, but from winter 22 last year. So we piloted also on the other side of the train station in Malmi. And there's a very beautiful park by the cultural center that is quite active. There's about 400 events every year. And the park has been really poorly used, although it's very beautiful, but it's been considered kind of unsafe and unfriendly, and people don't like to be there. But we renovated the lighting infra, and that provided a possibility to pilot with light. And we piloted a solution that enabled the citizens to change the color and the color tone of lighting. And that was actually a hit. So people really liked it. So there was a big light event called Lux Helsinki in the whole city, but within that district. So this park was more interesting than the local Lux Helsinki event during that time in the city center. But on the long run, this kind of interactive, customizable lighting provides also possibilities to extend, for example, the event use of the park for the cultural center to longer in the fall and winter time. And it also provided us ideas how to use, for example, such customizable lighting for wayfinding uses, really to help the people find, for example, to events or when it's happening or other cases. And well, in the end, I want to say that really we feel that experimentation and placemaking provide opportunities between planning phase and then the development plans. Also, this park is waiting for total renovation in 2025. And it's really about co-creating public spaces, and it's done by engaging the residents, exploring new smart solutions, and thus making collaborative changes in the urban spaces. Thanks.
Brilliant, thank you. Because it's true that we talk a lot about urban mobility, but it's important also to have nice places to go to and fun experiences to share with others. And there's a comment, in the chat saying that yeah, having citizens being able to change the lighting sounds like a really fun idea and something that might actually be a nice thing to go and see and do. Maybe that's something to go and visit in Helsinki. Thank you, Kaiser, for sharing that story and that insight. Let's then travel over to Austria, Vienna. Maximilian, can you tell us something about where do people meet in Vienna or wherever it is you are based? How do they get there, and what does that tell us about public space?
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to share with you this hour, a bit more than an hour in this afternoon. I'm actually not so much working in practice. That's why I cannot bring you directly a project by myself. But I would like to bring you another example that has fascinated me very impressively over the last years. I've always been reading more about that, and that has been hugely provocative and a big source of conflicts in Vienna. So I also select an example from my city where I live in. I would like to talk a little bit about the famous Donauinsel. It's an island in the Danube that from the first point of time doesn't sound very spectacular, but it was constructed by a human power and hands. So that makes it already a little bit more extraordinary because it's an island in the middle of the Danube that stretches over 22 kilometers along and is basically a mega structure, a mega project for inundation protection. So this island will protect us in Vienna from 1,000 year events in inundations. But it's not only that, because there have been some spaces next to the Danube that were accessible to people. Starting from this construction time, it was not anymore in the 70s. And it was constructed and planned as a technical building. So it was meant to be, in the beginning, a complete desert island. Then they said, well, for static reasons, we need to put some plants on that. We need to put some trees so that the roots can take the space and actually fix the ground, because we cannot just dump it all up with cement and other materials. And then people said from the surroundings, there's such a beautiful nature growing on this island. I want to go there, but we're not allowed to. So after quite a big conflict and quite a big mobilization event from civil society in the city, this island was then opened for people to actually visit it. And is nowadays one of the biggest recreational parks and places to gather, places to have the nice evening sunshine and sunset, and also where you would meet to dance or to have any workshop of any kind. So it's an enormously beneficial construction that was in the beginning planned as a complete non-human and very far from human realities um, thing, and was then recuperated by quite an impressive pressing and organization of civil society, and is nowadays one of the biggest and most well kept and also well loved places in Vienna, of the Viennese. And you see, I'm talking about that outside. It's 30 degrees, so I'm also looking forward to checking it out later on. But before going there, I will tell you how to get there, because I usually go there by bike. But being a late starter in Vienna, Vienna didn't have subways for, well, most of its history. And just in the 70s, we started construction of that. And nowadays, you can go there to the island via 3 lines. So we'll take one of these to get there then later on. What is interesting to this about me is that, as said, I don't work so much in practice or in realization of small projects. I am more working on innovation programming on the one side. Within Austria Tech, we support the Ministry for Climate Action to do an ambitious and hopefully well-aimed innovation programming in the mobility sector. And at the same time, I do something similar for the Driving Urban Transitions Partnership under the framework of the 15-minute city. And there again, it comes together where we talk about mobility, but not only about mobility, also on city planning, on places to enjoy, on challenges of logistics, and of all the urban governance that is behind this, of making things happen. So I'm glad to continue exchanging, and I hand back to you.
Great, thank you, Maximilian. Yeah, I mean, urban space is alive, and there is an interaction between what is planned and then what actually happens, and it's not always what is planned that happens. That's also interesting information. Thank you, Max. Let's go over then to Philippe. Can you also tell us a little story about where people meet, whether it is where you're based or in some of the projects that you've been involved with Urban Radar?
Absolutely, absolutely. Sorry, is my screen shared? Because I don't see
We'll
it.
put we'll put it up. Yeah.
Okay. Perfect. I can see it now. All right. So it's really good to be with everybody today. So I'm very pleased to share my experience. So what I wanted to share with you is simply a street where I used to live in, because I think that shows the power of urbanism and how streets are currently changing. So that's Rue Saint-Gilles in Paris. So it's close to uh, Parc des Vosges, where, in Paris, like Parc des Vosges with arcades. So I used to live next to here, and you can see on that street, and you can see how on the picture of the top, when I lived there, actually, how it was. My view was when I get out of the apartment was a wall, so I could see a bit of green behind, but essentially it was walls, very narrow curbs. It was not very safe to necessarily to walk, not crazy lights, etc. And what the city has done in many projects throughout the city in Paris has been to change the cities through micro changes. And here we can see the power of taking a wall down. So basically, by taking this wall down, um, I simply love it because the whole street is now changed. We have tremendously more space. We can see it's obviously tremendously safer as well to walk. We have greenery. We feel like we're not anymore like kind of in a jail with an initial wall. All of a sudden we're like with more greenery, and we feel closer to it. And at the same time, I want to stress on this a lot about these changes. So it's about obviously the greenery, more accessible, which improves the quality of life. I remember as well with the walls, we used to have crazy sounds because the sound would bounce on the wall. We don't have that anymore, and that makes as well the overall daily life way better. We can now open the windows where we couldn't do before. So to Jean-Paul's question, where to meet in an apartment in Paris without cars, a bouncing sound is a massive improvement for me. And same thing with the pollution, the air quality on the street feels better. I don't know if it's real or not, but it does feel better. And of course, that's the last point you can see on the slide. It's also an amazing thing is it's also part of fighting the urban heat we have throughout any city in Europe. Like more greenery, opening cities is changing everything. So what I didn't put on these slides, which is a bit silly of me, is if you look at the slide at the bottom, there's a black door in the middle. In the 2023 picture, there's some sort of a black door. And that changes everything even better because basically through this door, we can access a park. And I'm saying I'm silly because I should have put a picture because that's where we meet people. So we have a better quality of life in that street simply by taking out a wall. But then we have access to a park with a bunch of trees where we can meet friends and we're outside and really feel like we are in an open city as compared to before, which was closed. And all of this is through urbanism, is through very involved cities and people who work towards improving cities and quality of life. And I will explain to you, I hope, a bit later, how we contribute with data about making this stuff happen. So that's my story from Paris.
Thanks, Philippe. Yes, it's the power of what looks like a relatively small decision, but it can have a big impact in a street. And it's actually quite nice because some of these before and after pictures usually are linked to, let's say, cars, especially in a narrow street like that. And what you're saying is, I mean, they could have maybe potentially made it pedestrian, but simply just removing that wall is already creating space, It almost seems
It's
like it's
incremental.
encroaching on what used to be private space. But anyway, that's another matter.
No, it's a public space, actually.
Public space.
But it's a good point what you say, because it's actually incremental. Change is incremental. Of course, we have our dream city utopia, but changes are incremental, and this is to some extent a good example. And let's see what's next. It's going to be like case
Nice.
showed.
Thanks, Philippe. So, well, what is next is also to hear from Alexandra's stories. Alexandra, you do a lot of research on various cities around the world. So, looking forward to hear some snippets from you.
Thank you. Hi. So my side of the story, my name is Alexandra Gomez. I work at LSE Cities, and I bring you another side of the story. I bring you the side of cities who are car-centric, developed, and that invest in car infrastructure rather than investing in streets and public transport, mass public transport. And the question was, where do people meet? And I bring the case of Abu Dhabi here. And here you can see that, this is a petrol station. In a city where highways and roads are dominant and the primary infrastructure in the city, petrol stations become the place to meet. Often people meet randomly because they're putting petrol in their cars, or even they socialize in central nodes, which are the petrol stations, in the way between their work and their homes. And this slide, you can see that even TripAdvisor has some of these places advertised as places to meet and places to come and eat. In the same line of thinking, and this is another place from the Gulf, this is Kuwait, but this also applies to many cities in the world, not only in the Middle East, but also in the Americas and US, but also, I had the conversation with some colleagues about some suburban areas of, Belgium and other European countries. And for example, in cities where public space is designed for cars and there's no space for people to walk and to relax, and this is the case of Kuwait, people meet in shopping malls. And this is called the Avenues, and it's a shopping mall that replicates streets from all over the world. And people go to these fake streets in a way and socialize and meet because they're comfortable and they're walkable, because their real streets are not comfortable and they're not prepared for people to walk. And why does this happen? Because we have to think that urban development influences public space and influences how we build how we can build better transport infrastructure. And Kuwait and Abu Dhabi are not compact as Singapore and Hong Kong. They're not well connected. They don't have the same mass transit infrastructure, also because of the lack of compactness. And there's also issues of governance. But what I want to bring here is that because of land availability and availability of oil, the way these two cities developed led to a car-centric development, and that influences how people meet and where do they meet and how do they get there. And often those who can drive are locked to driving more and more. But what is the impact of driving? And this slide just to show that there is environmental impact and there's a space consumption, space occupied by the cars in the streets. And of course, linked to both of this, you have pollution, you have issues of health linked to pollution, but also lack of walkability can have consequences, is obesity and diabetes, for example. I guess I wanted to say that, for example, in London, and we've been also doing research at LSE Cities on London, while TfL is nudging and incentivizing people to use mass transit infrastructure, the Elizabeth line just opened. They just opened a super loop and extended the bus routes. At the same time, the mayor created a control measure for those entering with their cars in the borders of the GLA. And this is this was already a measure that existed, but was now extended on the 29th of August to the remaining areas, or most of the area of the GLA. And the interesting fact here is that there was a movement against this measurement, and the mayor was accused of increasing the economic burden, of being lack of transparency and democratic imposition of rules, and of controlling their people's freedoms and people's rights. So I think this also to show that, when we are dealing with changing behavior, we need to not only think about how we do it, but also promoting alternatives, and that's part of the discussion. But we are not defending that we can't drive completely, and of course we need to think, what is fair, who can eventually need to drive, and what type of benefits should we give to those who, for example, because of inclusivity, social justice, of affordability, how can we still promote that these people are allowed to move and they have subsidies, or they have or they're entitled to drive more than others, and that would be that is something that we want to explore in a future project. But again, and as I mentioned, it's not only the environmental impact, it's not only who can drive and who can't drive, or who should take public transport, and it's how much space is occupied by cars in our streets. And this is, for example, I'm from Lisbon, and most of the streets in Lisbon, the sidewalks are occupied by cars. How much space is that occupying? And we can see this is just a small, very drafty example of the occupation of road space against the occupation of space for public transport and pedestrians. So if we take out some of the space from the cars, what can we do with it? And how should we create our streets in our cities? And I just brought this example to say that, our planning still creates and in a way instigates parking spaces. We are building more and more with parking spaces and driveways, and somehow in cities like London, these spaces that are private are being traded as assets, and people are making money with it. And we're thinking, why can we not use these to increase public space and increase nature within the cities, for example? And to finish, I just want to bring the case of Lisbon, and and to just give us an idea that streets can be pedestrianized. Some of the street spaces can be taken for cars, and this is just an example of one street. But I think we need to think about how and for whom we want to create these streets, how to design them better, and how we deal with issues of transportation, accessibility, and affordability within our cities. Yeah, thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Alex, for taking us through different examples here of some of the research that you've done. And even if the highly car-centric example maybe sounds a little bit foreign to some of the maybe European audience, nevertheless, we do still have an issue with car-centricism, if I may say. And it's interesting to look at these different projects and understand, what brings about change, where does it come from? And I'd like to go a little bit further now into this discussion in terms of these dynamics of change, okay? Because as we saw with Maximilian's example, spaces in cities are alive. And they somehow connect between, bottom-up approaches and top-down approaches, and all this happens in cities. And I'd like to understand that a little better. So in terms of these dynamics of change, can I just ask, are cities and citizens actually open to change if it's not coming from them? Okay, and EIT Urban Mobility has published a poll. Maybe we could just launch the results of that poll just to have a look at the image of the results. What we can see is that the question was basically asking, how much are you willing to change, and what are you willing to compromise for? If we could just show the image of that, so that we can see the results. Yep, can we show the image? Perfect, thank you. So the question was, would you support the repurposing of your street, trading on-street parking for green spaces, outdoor seating, and vibrant recreational areas? Okay, so in principle, great things to be looking forward to. And 64% of respondents, there were more than 200, said absolutely, and even if there is no parking at all available. So I'm willing to really trade my car and my parking, no problem. So obviously, this is a community that's following EIT urban mobility. So maybe, to be fair, it doesn't fully reflect the realities of the dynamics of change in cities. And I'd just like you to react to that. Maybe starting with Kajsa, can you tell us something about these dynamics of change? I mean, do you think that citizens are really willing to, change their streets and their cities?
Well, I think you were right when talking about the EIT mobility bubble, but still, at least in Helsinki bubble, so at least the people living in the kind of central Helsinki are quite open to leading a more car-free life. Of course, that doesn't mean that you don't own a car or don't use the car, but at least kind of switching to kind of more sustainable modes of transport. But of course, we in Helsinki, we have very good public transportation. We start to have better bike routes as well. We are looking to what they've done in Copenhagen and Amsterdam, and it's become a lot better here as well. But people are open to change. But then, for example, commercial operators in the city center are very much opposing making the city center car-free, although the city and many people also are demanding it. So there are kind of a lot of there's a lot of different opinions, and there's a lot of different players you need to kind of take along. So there's need for a collaboration discussion on that.
Yeah, and you bring in the issue of the operators, of the businesses who are also reacting or acting differently to citizens. Alexander, in some of your research, or as a kind of a conclusion of all that research, would you think that citizens are actually open to change, especially when it's not driven by them?
Well, that doesn't have one answer, right? I don't think any one of us can respond to that. But what I can say is, look, there's a few issues that we need to consider. One is, where is that change happening? So if you are changing a square into something more green in the city center, maybe citizens are more open to change. But as we saw from the London example, if you're changing in a more controlled way rather than nudging or engaging with the population, and it's outside the city center, it might be more tricky. So there's a few things to consider. Where are you doing this? Then the process is important. The more you engage with the people to whom this has an impact, and we're talking about people who live in these spaces, work in these spaces, but also might be visiting these spaces. I think engagement, inclusion in the process is fundamental. Another thing that has happened in a few cities is going from a short-term temporary use into reflecting the impact of that short-term temporary use and then adapting it to a longer term. And that could also be something to test out and then change in the future for something less temporary. And finally, I think it's the tipping point. So we all changed with COVID. It wasn't imposed, neither by the top. Well, maybe it was imposed by the top because of all the measures, but in a way, COVID led us to change without us wanting to. And a lot of us are now working from home at least 2 or 3 days a week. So what is the tipping point that makes us all want to change? And I think that is the question for everyone in a way.
Okay, yeah. So that's a few background elements that we have to keep in mind when bringing about change. In some of the projects that you've been involved with Urban Radar, Philippe, what would be your assessment? I mean, do you feel that citizens are open to change when there are policies that sort of implement projects in their areas and their neighborhoods? I think Philippe may have frozen. So I'll just ask that question to Maximilian.
Glad to take it. Oh, he's back. Well, I might go in the meanwhile. Well, first of all, it gave me a little bit to think when we talked about the bubble from EIT mobility. I think we definitely encounter this in many circumstances, be it on Twitter, be it in our working environment. I also see that all of us are from capital cities here, from the speakers at least. So also interesting to see. Also a small bubble. When talking about openness for change, I like to take a look into our playbook from my organization, as we are accompanying mainly Austrian cities, but also a bit beyond that, and transfer learnings, especially from research and practice from other places to Austrian contexts and Austrian challenges. We like to look to Milano, and we like to learn from Milano, because there they found out that you can bring change to the ground, especially when it concerns local small neighborhood centers, when you can redistribute public spaces. If you consider one element, you need to close down the streets and make children play on the former streets. When children take and appropriate the space, usually everybody is okay with that. So kind of for me that's an interesting criteria that I can maybe add to there, besides from agreeing to everything that was said already. And we also try to take this to the heart. And I think we see it also that either intuitively or strategically, usually redevelopment projects are started next to schools. We would pedestrianize school exits or center place redevelopments, like square redevelopments on school buildings, because we have public ground there, usually public property, so it's easier for all processes. So I really think kind of the school and children consider them as actors of change, and also their institutions as the hubs for that. And maybe just one last thing to that, we can always talk about changing something. I think most of the society in general would have an open ear to that, but you need to present alternatives. You cannot just take something away and don't give alternatives. And also you shouldn't name it taking away, but you should focus on what you give them instead.
Yeah, and that has to be tricky in an urban context, because it's true that, you know, everything is quite tightly knit, and so if you start making changes in a place, I mean, it will have quite immediate repercussions on the space itself, on the immediate surroundings. So it can't be that easy actually to offer so many alternatives, and maybe that's actually something to think about. You know, how to build alternatives when you're making change in a city. Philippe, if we're back, if we've unfrozen you, can you also give some insights from your project, and, you know, how open do you think citizens are to change in their cities?
So what I was reflecting on was, so currently in cities throughout the world, probably, so we have this reshuffle of public space, which also leads to conflict of usage. So, you know, we want more children to play, less car park. There's always a conflict of usage. There's always a trade-off, and that's what's I think that's what's happening right now. It's more exacerbated than it used to be, probably, and especially like Alexandra was saying about the tipping point of COVID. So at this time, so during COVID, I was living in San Francisco. They were the first one to start embracing, you know, the tactical urbanism, closing streets. I would go pick up my daughter at school on a scooter, but like super far. It was safe. She would be on a bike, learning to bike, stuff we would not have imagined before COVID. And actually, I suspect the city has kept some of it. It's San Francisco, and it's quite a liberal city, and so on and so forth. But I think, unfortunately, COVID, one could have expected in human nature, but we kind of come back from COVID, forget all about it, start back flying and everything. But I feel like, nonetheless, climate change is a much more serious consideration, which mobilize a lot of citizens, especially the young ones. And that leads to new urbanism, new ways of living, and also questioning the way we live, the quality of life, and all this, you know, even the noise pollution and everything. So, you know, we start being more aware to be like, hold on, do we want to keep burning the planet and ourselves in a way. And to me, then, it's not about citizen. Quite frankly, I think it's about political will and political or the elected official who are either, because there's two ways, right? So either absolutely convinced of their city views or urbanism view, but at the same time, you also have the elected official who will actually work to get, who will tend to be more cynical, work to get elected. But as we have younger people involved in expecting better way of living, better quality of life and everything, the politician will follow. And I think that's how citizen will change. I think it's not an individual change. I think it's a generational change. Citizens are user of a city, and the elected official when they see that, they'll be like, oh shoot, we need to adapt to this. More cars will not work anymore. We need more parks. So that's my view about the change to citizen. I think it's not individual change, but it's generational change.
Okay, so you're also bringing in then this political will dimension, and maybe that takes us a little bit closer then to how to apprehend a strategy of change in the cities. I mean, we've seen some of the constraints that cities may have, and that citizens might feel they don't want to have so much change. Others might want some change, so we have this kind of conflict of how much change is required in a city. But let's assume that we want to bring about change, right? And this is what we're talking about. How do we start building that? How can we give a few insights to the audience who might also be thinking, how do we actually go about creating change in cities? And maybe to link up with the political will then, Kaisa, I mean, you've explained how it almost feels like in Helsinki and the surroundings, you have these places where you can experiment, where you can innovate, where you can change things. So there's an interaction with the citizens, but there's also an interaction with the public authority itself. How did you get about getting this political will that is then quite manifest to, support change and experimentation in Helsinki? How did that come about?
I think Forum Virim Helsinki, as we are owned 100% by the city of Helsinki, so we have city trusts us, and we bring about the ideas what we want to do, but we are kind of very free to work in the space that's provided for us. And of course, everything we do is aligned with the city objectives, the strategy, and of course, the city strategies are always aligned with the objectives for battling climate change and reaching the climate goals, for example. So as long as, and we are always there, so we have the right to act. And for example, in the different districts we've been working on, so I think it's really about experimentation and about not always having the right solutions, but at least having as many learnings as possible, and communicating the learnings then to the city so that they can take them into account in their decision making, or sometimes also changing the ways the cities work with, for example, their the planning, so that they kind of find better ways to interact with the citizens, to engage them, and take new solutions into use.
Okay, so there is a high integration here in this example of Helsinki. Max, I mean, you're supporting projects in various countries. Do you tend to see this level of integration, that there's a strong will to experiment and innovate with space like we have in Helsinki, or is it rather quite complicated sometimes to actually support projects of this nature because they're just not there?
Yeah, it also goes back again to the political will and also the perceived political will. I think that's even a meta level above, because if you perceive something as not possible in a context, you also won't try. So I think there are many hurdles to experimenting. Still, we see it as one of the main theory of changes that we actually have when we support projects, because through experimentation and testing, citizens will have the possibility of getting in touch with how it will feel when the project is done. And we need to give a quick and short way of having these experiences. Otherwise, we won't get people on board, and we won't create enthusiasm for a thing that we, from a political measure or an intervention that we, from a not techno, but from a policy side, see as beneficiary, but we somehow also don't have the vocabulary to communicate that. So we need to make these experiences possible. So I thought of one example when we were talking about that, and that concerns the biggest shopping street in Vienna that was redeveloped into a pedestrian zone in 2015, more or less about this time. And there especially, kind of the whole plan was ambitious, massive participatory endeavors, huge effort, but there was no way of actually seeing how this will look like, so nobody could imagine it. And also there was a temporary zone where there were no real construction measures actually taken. So the temporary zone was, again, the same street as was there before, so nobody could imagine how this will look like. So agreeing to this project was very off. And so I think for that, experimentation is key. Also testing, being able to feel something, and even if it's something that is just paint on the floor, as Milan shows us.
Yeah, and Alexandra as well. Maybe a comment from you, because given that you have quite a few insights into various cities, you know, how do you, well, do you perceive this general lack of political will, and how does one bring about, you know, a stronger involvement on the political level? Because even though there might not be a will, there are still many obligations weighing down on cities to make changes, to meet certain targets, whether these are, you know, related to air quality or noise, or many different obligations. So is that the driver, the kind of regulatory obligations on cities, or are there other drivers that can, you know, implement change or help implement change?
That's a tough question. Well, yes, I think I agree with my colleagues. There's then we need the connection between citizens pressuring the political and the government, and then the governance wanting to change and somehow influencing behavior. In some of the cities that I've explored, for example, in the Middle East, in Kuwait, when for COVID cars were parked, people used public space in a different way. So why is the political will not there to change and improve public space when we proved that, you know, people could use it and they were enjoying that use? In some cases, I think we also have to think about the temporality of the elections. You know, politicians are elected for 4 years. They have a limited time to promote change. A lot of times they leave. They might not have the fundings, but also we also need to think about the impact of change. We might improve a square, but then there's gentrification, and then people are not able to live in around that square. So this is a very complex system, and you know, we need to think at change at different levels, at the city level, neighborhood level, and street level at the same time. We need to think about temporality, and I think the idea of testing is interesting. But you know, there's a temporality of decision making too that we have to consider. And then there's funding. Not all cities have the money of Milan or, you know, London to invest in big changes, which is also something to consider.
Yeah, I mean, you're putting your reputation on the line, and you're taking risks in creating experiments, and you know, if they are only going to be short term, not necessarily leading to long term change, you know, why put your reputation on the line? I guess that is a bit of a challenge. I'd like to just touch upon also the way that digitalization is also reshaping this whole discussion. Both in the way digitalization can help implement certain experiments, but also then the feedback and the return on in the information that you get on experiments. And there's also a question on that in the audience. When these experiments are carried out, how far is technology, AI used to kind of analyze data, and how do you connect that? So maybe Philippe, a reaction on that. How are digital tools reshaping decision making? Number one, and how are you using them in experiments to collect data?
Yeah, absolutely. So at Urban, let me give you some context. So we started Urban Radar about 5 years ago on the base that cities and transportation are seeing a massive transition, potentially a revolution, which has been accelerated by COVID and now the climate change realization. And the whole goal was, how can we help cities make better decisions with data? So, because there is so much data around, very little is actually used when so much insights, basic knowledge could support targeted, more efficient decisions. So that's why we started Urban Radar, and we very quickly worked on so talking about users in cities. So we worked with cities on economic development of cities, retail, and how to basically energize cities economically. But also for us, the big users of a city are actually the logistics people. So urban logistic people, they use a city. So everywhere, all the time, we don't see them, but that's massive users. They need to use the cities, and there's nothing really for them, or whatever it is was done years ago. And misplaced loading zones and these type of things. So what we've seen is, first of all, in the past years, I'm amazed to see how much cities, again, between Europe and the US, are evolving fast when it's about working more vertically, so cross silos, but also being more digitized, working more with data. It's going very fast, I think. It's the speed of a city. It's always frustrating because it's a big machine and so on, but nonetheless, it could be substantially slower. So that means cities embrace this change, these new tools. And then what we work with cities with is simply help them understand what's really happening now, as opposed to a long study it takes 2 or 3 years to do and it's obsolete when it's published. So we help them understand what's happening now so they can base decision with current data. And so it's decision analytics and everything. And then they apply it. So that's more the use cases. They apply this knowledge to tackle subjects like congestion. Again, it's linked to quality of life and everything. They will tackle subject about air quality, economic dynamism, but also safety, which is an increasingly big topic as well. And what we've seen being promising right now, how they use it. So it's one, the ability to understand and make use of the data available, which is one thing. Then where we have substantial, I would say, traction and inbound, basically, cities asking for help is working with core data. So essentially nowadays we can provide very targeted insights about how people move, how people navigate a city, when they stop, when, basically we see massive trends about origin, destination with very, very, very clear pictures throughout the time of the day and everything. So cities use that to actually learn about to learn how efficient are the regulation and identify the updates they could make.
Okay,
Then
so you're painting a
yeah.
picture where the data reduces that risk that we were talking about when politicians have their reputation on the line. I mean, they can basically anticipate with the analysis of this data that certain changes will have certain effects.
Correct. So it's so it's understanding what's happening and then projecting and planning for the future. But that's a game changer. And in a way, if you think from a political point of view, true, Jean-Paul, it actually reduces the risk of the political decision because it's like you're closer to the reality, so your political risk or your decision risk is reduced. So that's what we support. What's very important to us as Urban Radar and the way we do things, it also, I mean, it's really that it helps unblindfolding cities. Because right now they don't know exactly what's happening, so it's blindfolded, which means implementations are not targeted, money is not totally well spent. And right now, the way we in a way we love to help, the best success for us, it's targeted decision, efficient money spent, and then you measure the result. That's also the big change. You measure results so you can adapt, and the cities become more agile.
Okay, thanks for those insights. And I'd like to also get Kaiser onto this topic to try and understand how do you also then plug in some of these tools to collect and analyze data when you're carrying out your various experiments in the various places that you have at your disposal. You know, is that fueling also the move from short-term experiments to longer-term outcomes? Does the data, artificial intelligence, all these various digital tools help to get there?
Well, as Forum Virium Helsinki is dealing with a lot of the digital, so of course we are looking into data and how to use it in almost all our services. And I have to say that in general, so we have a good backbone because the city of Helsinki already is using a lot, for example, map-based services for participatory planning. So that's something they do. So we have that on place. Also, the city of Helsinki has a very good digital twin, and Forum Virium Helsinki has a team working on that. And also in the future, we'll be looking into the social aspects of the digital twin more in detail. So that's something we're very interested to do. But what comes to experimentation, yes, we do collect data, and yes, we think that in addition to data, you also need just pure observation to enrich, like qualitative data to enrich kind of the insights, and especially when you do something small and not with cars running around, but with people in spaces. So you don't always have the opportunity to have data or cameras, and especially if you're doing something temporary. So you have to kind of try to get what you can and then do observation and talk to people. So that's also very important. But of course, when you want to do systemic change, you have to feed in the insights and the understanding to the city in various ways. And I really do hope that in the future, also, things like the digital twin could also feed more kind of short-term temporary experimentation, because that's the way to kind of on short term also get better view of what's happening. We have some examples, but I can take that later.
Just for my understanding, that when you say digital twin, are you talking about some kind of equivalent virtual world to whatever world it is you have in real life? Is that what we're talking about?
Well, a digital twin is kind of representing data you have from the city, like from different places that you can put on a map and view it. You can have like several digital twins concentrating on different aspects. I'm not working on the twins. I'm maybe not the best person to describe them, but they can give you different visual representations of the data you have. Yeah. And would hope to have like also social data there, and would like to have representations for people who are not like kind of urban planners, but also people who work kind of more on the experimentation side of things. But like said, so currently we do also a lot of observation, but try to kind of feed in different data to the system.
Yeah, understood. Max, then also in the projects that you're supporting, are you facilitating also then this this access to digital tools? Is that an important part of creating change, supporting decision making, and how do you integrate it?
Well, me personally, it's not the focus of my work. I'm city planner and economist, so kind of some quantitative input, but more on the qualitative methods that I'm focusing. Also, I've been working a little bit more in social innovations research. So this is basically kind of a little bit where I come from, and thus I also have this lens usually that I'm using for problems, kind of more institutional and social innovation lens, so to say. But at my company, at Austria Tech, there are many of my colleagues that really have a closer eye on the technological side. But that's not so much on my tasks. But what I actually perceive is that in the cities that we're working with, there's a huge demand for data, and there's a huge demand for we need to have more tools, more methodologies to monitor the outcomes of our activities. But there is at the same time a big lack of experts and capacities. So I always see a little bit this unbalance and ask myself kind of how can we bring balance in there, and will this be enough by purchasing consultants or companies from the outside, or how can we actually make or facilitate this digital work in traditional city administrations? Would be an interesting question also for the others. I would like to learn about it.
Maybe Alex, do you wanna chip in?
Well, I think I want to complement what Kaiser was saying, and I think having quantitative and qualitative data is fundamental, because we can see with quantitative data how people are moving and what they're doing, but we need to understand why they're moving like this and how and why they're doing what they do. So I think it's important that we look into both types of data. At LSE we often use data to create evidence-based results and analysis. And I think communication of data is another issue. How do we communicate with the citizens? Because we are constantly communicating with academics and with politicians who know how to read maps, who know how to read data. But how do we communicate with citizens what we are seeing, and how can they learn with us and also contribute to this? So and then there's another issue, which is privacy, and a lot of people are reluctant to give data and to help academics in privacy issues, and how can we find co-ownership of data so that people also get something from it, and they also help the rest of the sector, the academic and the politicians. But I think one thing that I think missed here is the potential of these new immersive 3D experiences. And the other day I was experimenting one of those glasses, and it was during the Urban 95, which is an initiative at a collaboration that LSE Cities has. I put the glasses and I felt like I was a 3-year-old in the street, and I could feel the proximity of the cars, and I could hear the sound of the traffic. And I think the potential of these tools, and of course, there's challenges and opportunities with all this, and we need to be careful, but the new tools might, make it easier for people to understand change and understand the reality of other people.
Yep, and I think we've covered quite some ground on this interaction between the digitalization and decision making. There's one thing I'd like to come back to a little bit, is the potential opposition that you can get from certain actors, and Kaiser mentioned the operators, the businesses that are a bit peculiar in this whole conversation. There's a comment in the audience related to the example in Barcelona, where They say a public commercial association has won a lawsuit against the city council to compel them to reverse the project of a superblock already built. Okay, and so the question is, what is your opinion, and why do you think that commercial associations are opposed to these kinds of initiatives? Specifically commercial associations, business operators. That's a very specific community that would also carry quite some weight and influence and political leverage in principle as well in cities. So I'd like to get your opinion on that. Why do you think these operators are more potentially complex to convince about change than others? Who would like to have a go at that one?
I'm happy to start. So and make the link as well in a way. It's like for us, I mean, data for data is obviously useless. It's really about what we see is so data for, as I mentioned, for targeted action. That's very important. But at the same time, with the technology we do, the technology in itself has no value if there's no public-private discussion, if there's not the usual discussions and everything. So in terms of how of cohabitation and conflict of interest, we still need like kind of this grassroots type work about stakeholder management and essentially getting multiple people with different interests towards a shared ground. A shared ground. So, and going back to just to follow the thread I was taking before about urban logistics, when we work nearly in all the cities we work in on urban logistics, we also work with logisticians. We work with the delivery companies as well, because it doesn't work the way like one side decides it all for the other one. It's like it needs to be a better balanced discussion. Ironically, with data, you have, again, having more precise knowledge, you can have more effective, in a way, data-based discussion with better ground truth to find a compromise. And that we essentially see it everywhere. And what I'm as well passionate, that's personal, but what I'm very impressed in is like when the private sector is thirsty to talk to cities, they want to, except they stop doing it because it's like every time it's too slow, it doesn't, it's like it's frustrating. They don't speak the same language. So if we can facilitate an evidence-based discussion, public-private discussion of different stakeholder groups, we get to more win-win situations. And then, of course, going back to if there's no political will, nothing's going to happen. I mean, that's still essential.
Yep. Okay. Thank you. That's a possible solution to overcoming the barrier that seems to have occurred in Barcelona. Kaiser, a comment also then on these more private operators, commercial operators.
Yeah, I actually come back, like Alexandra mentioned early on today, what the COVID did. So actually, like if we think about city centers and how much has changed in the city centers since COVID, because people are staying at home at least the 2 days within a week. So there's been at least in Helsinki, and I know in other cities as well, I presume. So the city centers have become more quiet. There's more, at least in Helsinki, there's more spaces that are not in use. So basically, they to be able to live, the private operators need to act, and we need to also hear them. So it's you have to think about the systemic thing, and therefore also for us like Urban Lab players. So we always kind of try to bring the different players on the table. So sometimes also experimentation is a good way to kind of make small things visible and then understand each other's perspectives.
Okay, thanks. And I'd like to maybe now move a little bit out of the city centre because we've spoken quite a bit about these experiments more in an urban context. There's a question in the audience that takes us a little bit out of the city centre and more the outskirts, potentially even the countryside. And I'd like to go to maybe Alex or Max on, can you share any examples of experiments or placemaking that has either happened outside of cities or somehow helped to connect city centers then with outskirts? Are there any examples, and how different is it from experiments? Can one of you two help us out?
Well, to be honest, I'm from LSE Cities. We mostly look into cities, so bringing an example that it's not from a city center is more tricky for me. But I think what we have to think about is there is this idea of proximity, and somehow if we go out of the city center, we might have this proximity back to our society. So people will be closer to each other, they might be closer to supermarkets and to basic needs. The important then is, how can we live outside of the city center and still have access to the university or to the hospital, because we can't have those facilities and big institutions everywhere. So in one hand, we need to, investment in proximity, local consumption, which is also being discussed about climate change, reducing traveling. That helps people who investing in areas that are not the city centers might help with that. But at the same time, we can't forget that, these people might have to travel. And then how do we do that? The other issue with experimenting outside the city center, I guess it's also with the digital. Right now, more and more, you don't need to go to you don't need to go to a Michelin star restaurant and sit down. Maybe you can order online. But then you don't want all these drivers coming out and in from the city center. So there's the investing in areas that are outside of the city need a bit of adaptability also to the digital, and trying to understand how we can live differently in these areas. But there is the opportunity, and a lot of people left the city because of COVID, because they want, because they don't need to come back to the city center every day. So there is the opportunity to change a lot these areas and improve public space. And I used to live in an area that is quite central within London, but it feels quite suburban. And the railway, for example, blocks one side of the street from the other. And there's no way, streets that are blocked because they're only made for cars to come back. So dealing with this type of challenges for outside suburban living, in a way, I think it's important. And this idea of proximity could be the potential way of looking into it.
Okay. Max, maybe to take you on a slightly on a tangent to this, and to bring it back a bit more to actual urban mobility solutions as well. I mean, we've talked about public space, but when it comes to urban mobility, I mean, the traditional way to move around public space would have been public transport, right, which has been made available, collectivizing mobility for many people. And you mentioned you can even use it to access the island that you talked about, right? So public transport almost, crystallizes the way you move around in public space. But more and more, this public space is being challenged by many different business-driven urban mobility solutions, a lot of innovation going on, a lot of different ways of moving around. And we've talked a lot about closing spaces to cars and pedestrianizing and things like that. But how should cities, evolve with all these business decisions being made that they're not always directly linked to, right? Sometimes these are just businesses coming into space, citizens saying, well, this is great, using these services. And this is moving on a trajectory that is aside from policy and planning. So how does one deal with that evolution?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. It's a question that can always only be answered when the next phenomenon is here and takes space on public spaces. We have been surprised, I think, by the scooters in the beginning. We have been surprised by the influx of the Chinese bikes, basically from one day to the other, and also the disappearance of them again because people were simply abusing them, misusing them. I don't know if in other cities also these experiences were made, but I imagine that some of them are rather similar. So I think there's no real answer to kind of to see how you can actually plan for this ahead. I think it's a gradual reaction, and it's obviously also a lagging behind on the regulatory axis, so to say. Obviously, the business model is quicker in being realized, in being offered, and if people then take it up, it has and starts to have a right to do so, or something, at least to some extent. I feel what we have seen in many cities in Europe is that step by step, after the first chaos, so to say, chaos created by the e-scooters, we have found ways of organizing and of finding um, practices that are more you, that are more, how do you say, like compatible with the rest of how we used to have a city, especially on the e-scooters. We have these places where you park them. Paris has decided to ban them, so there are different solutions on that. But I think it's always also a productive interchange that a new solution is offered. It might be taken up. It might be also be abused, like the Chinese bikes in Vienna, thrown into the rivers. But it has definitely, some things have become a big part of our daily mobility, such as micromobility. And now we're happy to have it, and it's a gradual process of bringing it together.
Yeah, because when we're talking about reconnecting people and places, I mean these mobility solutions are offering new ways of moving around the city at different speeds as well. You get sort of motorized pedestrians, if I may say, something like that. And Philippe, there might also be another development linked to the ability to use shared services as well, and all this is evolving and interacting with space, and it's not so easy for urban planners to take all of this into account, right?
Yeah, I think urban planners are all trying to figure it out, right? Aren't we all trying to figure out what's happening now and how we can make the most of it? To me, when about this shared mobility, what's the way we intervene on this? It's always a link from an urbanism point of view and a society point of view. It's a link, or citizen point of view. It's a link between the movement, so basically the items that move, so e-scooters or whatever, and assets, physical assets in the city. So it's going to be a link, say, to some stations, not shared mobility, but metro station or whatever. But also for scooters, what's very important is the aspect of equity, because you don't want to push or develop a further equity gap between people. So equity is very important, which means it brings some impact in the business model of these private companies, but that also means that commitments, basically they need to be monitored, and that's why we use again technology to capture and validate and learn constantly about how these new mobility are being used. Are the needs we expect initially intuitively are actually met? Are the links we think between different points being done or not? And then are the operators following their, say, contractual commitment in terms of rebalancing for equity or such things? So that's from I would say, technology point of view, what we look into, and that obviously applies to e-scooters, which is very public and people love to talk about it, to to more boring new mobility in cities, again, for people and goods and logistics, because that's where there's substantially more impact for citizens.
And maybe then just a final comment also from Kaiser on this, because you're more on the urban planning side, let's say, than specifically urban mobility in Helsinki. But how are you integrating all these changes? They're quite fast paced. You don't always know in which direction they're going. They're quite autonomous and independent. Different mobility solutions coming in. How are you integrating that into the way you apprehend urban planning and change in your city?
Well, actually, at Forum Virium Helsinki, so we have a mobility team, many of them working on different mobility topics. So basically, they have been following all those new services coming into. Whereas us from our team, so we've been looking also into shared services from the perspective of kind of sustainable neighborhoods. And actually, there's slight problems, for example, if you think about shared cars or shared, for example, cargo bikes, because in Helsinki, we are still a kind of small city compared to the big metropolis. So it's hard to get enough usage to make it a sustainable business, but working on it and coming there. But I would not go into commenting otherwise the mobility services because that's not kind of my piece of cake.
No, but in the end, I mean, that's also interesting to hear, because in the end, there are all sorts of different branches and departments that are working together when it comes to public space. I mean, you can even think of waste management, for instance. I mean, everyone is actually competing for public space, including on the public authority side. So it's just interesting to see that it's not an easy answer for any one of the departments. Great. So I'd like to just finish off then with a final round. The same question to all of you. I'd like to try and get you to answer it in a very short, maybe maximum 1 minute. Okay. And I'll start with Philippe. My question is, we've heard a lot about the 15-minute city, the concept in particular, which we haven't specifically spoken about, but we've spoken around it a lot. And the idea is to try and create more livable spaces. But we've seen a lot of backlash against this concept to say that actually it's a sort of quite a top-down approach that aims almost at the opposite of making cities and spaces livable. And I'd just like to get your comment on that. Why do you think that such a notion, such a concept, has created so much backlash actually in the public?
Thanks for asking. Thanks for asking. So, to me, I think the backlash comes from, in a way, yuppie perception. It doesn't take into account the social gap between people, especially between cities where you have access to everything, and the majority of Europeans who struggle to get from paycheck to paycheck. So it's like, okay, what's the priority here? But I want to turn it more positively, because we do a lot of work actually with rural areas, semi-rural area, about the 30 minutes. 15, it's a great marketing term and everything, but it's about still social equity. It's about how you get the social functions of the principle of the 15-minute city accessible to everybody. So we do, in rural area, we will work on half an hour access. Half an hour access to school, to health, to whatever it is, culture, etc. And that I think has really some grounds for future potential.
Okay.
So I think, here we go. So
it was the mic jumping out. That was the 1 minute. Thank you so much, Philippe, for having shared that insight. Shall we go to Kaiser? Why do you think there has been this
maybe I can continue after a while. I'm just thinking.
Okay, I'll give you one more. Alexandra, over to you. 1 minute.
1 minute. Oh, first, I think this, for me, just saying 15-minute city is a problem. I think cities are made of from 1 minute to an hour. You need to think about the street. You need to think about metropolitan area. And and if you say 15 minutes, looks like you're constraining people to live within that area. And I think people feel controlled. And then there's the whole process of doing it. While investing in 15-minute city, you're investing in cycling and walkability, but you might be forgetting people who need the bus and the train. And so social and spatial inequalities are leading people to revolt against the 15-minute city, which is, in a way of translating mixed-use compact cities. Like Lisbon is a 30-minute city in a way. So I think it's all about the process. It's all about understanding who are we affecting and what are the consequences of what we are doing, which doesn't mean we're doing something wrong. But while investing in cycling lanes, we also need to invest in public transport. And also it's because I think most of the people who are against it are people who live in the suburbs. Done. Sorry.
Well done. Thank you, Alexander. That was actually, that was insightful. I like that. Okay, Max, over to you. 1 minute.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I also want to underline that I think there are real fears behind that have to be respected and taken into account. I feel that people get this idea a lot misinterpreted. I when I talk about the 50-minute city, I always say that the core of it is not mobility, it's not housing, it's basically a very ambitious social infrastructure agenda. We want to give people the opportunity to have to fulfill their daily needs in a very close proximity. That's for me quite marvelous. But we somehow don't happen to manage to create the benefits or even the co-benefits that also come with it. I'm also, on the other hand, I'm also a bit with the Melbourne city planner that says we can understand fears and have to take this seriously, but we also don't have to say sorry to misinformation. And I think there's a lot of that also going on, targeted misinformation, where we have to say stop. That's not true. You're trying to create fears. So about this backlash, I have like a little bit of a two-sided opinion.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you, Max. And then Kaiser, over to you. The last word.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, thanks for really good comments, and I really like everyone's comments, and especially Alexandra talking about how you really have to think about all the angles. So it's really kind of 15-minute city. You have to think that it's kind of it's a systemic structure, and basically, if you think about a 15-minute city, so it can be kind of very central view in the cities, because most people, although they have all the services, but their lives are probably kind of more half an hour city. But we used to work with the Helsinki Smart City District Kalasatama, where we had the vision of 1 hour more a day for the citizens. So the city should be so smooth and so effective that kind of people gain 1 more hour a day. So kind of that's what I think the 15-minute city is about, so that kind of everything you need is there, so that you can use part of your time in the way you want.
Brilliant. Thank you, Kaiser. And as you said, you have shorter days as you head into the fall and winter, and we're already seeing this beautiful sunset in the mirror image there. So thank you for having stayed until the sunset, Kaiser, with us. Thanks to the 4 panelists. You've been fantastic. Max, Alex, Philippe, Kaiser. Thanks for sharing all these great insights, and we had a very active audience as well. So thanks to them. See you soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay,
Bye,
and
thank
now I will hand over the conclusions to a colleague from EIT Urban Mobility. Adrien Moulin is joining us. He is Course Development Manager at EIT Urban Mobility. We've heard quite a lot, Adrien, from our 4 speakers, a lot of comments in the chat as well. So, take us through what were your key insights, and anything else you'd like to tell us.
Thanks, Jean-Paul. Can you hear me? Yes? Okay. Thanks for this very good and very inspiring webinar, and good afternoon to everyone. So my name is Adrien. I work in the Competence Hub of the EIT Mobility, which is the professional school of the EIT Mobility. So I will briefly conclude today's mobility talk. First of all, thanks on behalf of the EIT Mobility, thanks to our 4 panelists for taking the time to prepare and join today's session. And thanks, Jean-Paul, for this very dynamic moderation. I picked up a few elements. I think we heard a lot about the use of space and the problem of the individual car, but also wanted to highlight some issues, things we hear less, and which I believe needs more debate. Firstly, on two examples which I found very interesting. The first one mentioned in Paris on the streets change. So it's not only about looking it's also about looking at opportunities that exist within the existing urban fabric, and not only about finding quality of life outside cities. It made me think of the idea of building the city on the city, which is used in France. And then the second example in Helsinki, with the color tones and the idea that citizens interact with the city, with the infrastructure. I think this is a very inspiring idea, and which makes cities more human. And then a few other points on the tipping point of change among citizen behavior, the political will and temporality of politics. How do you reach this tipping point in a very peaceful way in cities? The second point on the negative impact of mobility policies, and so we can't please anyone. The examples of the urban access regulations is very interesting. Who can drive, who not? Only the rich, only those who really need it, etc. The importance of providing alternatives was mentioned. I found this very important point. If you take away cars, you need to provide an alternative, high quality public transport, shared mobility, etc., which can be very challenging. And then finally, how to learn on how to make better evidence-based decision making with data. Very important point. Everyone needs to learn to know. Everyone needs to know to learn how to handle data and use that data, and it's not only for tech people. We have actually courses on these different subjects. So I would like to show you some of the education projects we developed under the professional school of the EIT of Mobility. The first slide you can see here, you can see on the top left, so we have three key products. The first one on the top left is called Urban Mobility Explained. It's a YouTube channel where we have about 50, 60 videos. We publish one almost every week. They are really an introduction to a variety of urban mobility related topics. We reached more than 3 million views now on those videos, so we're actually very proud of this. So I invite you to have a look. They may not all be relevant for you, but they may allow you to just briefly discover a subject which you didn't know about, or discover a case study, for example. The second one on the bottom, in the middle, is our e-course platform. So these are small MOOCs of 1 to 4 hours, which are published on our platform, Urban Mobility courses.eu, and you have the QR code here. We have about 40, 50 courses online. We publish a course every month. We have more than 30,000 registrations in this course, so the impact is huge also. I invite you to have a look, and I give you one or two examples in a second. And then our applied courses. So these are traditional courses, customized courses, which are also available on our platform. And these are much more specific, local. They're paid courses because of the value they bring, and usually in the local language of the country. And we cover about 12 countries so far within our school. And yes, the next slide. Oh, sorry, I need to use the clicker here. Does it work? It works. Here, so I mentioned the second category, the e-courses. You have some examples here in relation to topics we mentioned. All of them were mentioned, actually. The 15-minute city, and don't worry, it's not only about 15-minute city. We talk about 30 minutes, 20 minutes, 5 minutes, everything. So a very good point early on. The super blocks also, although there are only 2 super blocks, real super blocks, I think, in Barcelona, so which really follow the rules explained in this course. And we just updated this in the context of what was discussed today, actually, and the problem of developing those blocks. The WooNerve, for example, also concept in the Netherlands, and we just published a course on the urban heat islands together with and then our 2 other types of courses in relation to what we discussed today, and this will be it for me today. One course on communicative planning, designed with the Aalto University in Finland, so which really explained how, which the content is really based on the experience of Finnish cities on working with citizens. And then a great course on virtual reality and digital twins, and how this is used in urban design. This is an example from Belgium, and this is really a success case on our side, where we work with local companies and the French-speaking community on helping cities to to use the software. And this was mentioned today also. That's it on my side. And I have another final slide, some publicity for our Tomorrow Mobility conference. It's the leading European event on sustainable and intelligent urban mobility. It's in Barcelona in November. Please join. The website is here mentioned, tomorrowmobility.com. And yes, thanks again to everyone. Thank you, Jean-Paul, and bye-bye.